Okay, we were talking about offer and acceptance a few minutes ago, and I want to follow up on some thoughts about offer and acceptance. An offer gets made by one party. You know, I want to buy your notebook. I want to buy your computer. I want to go to work for you. I want you to come to work for me. Whatever the deal, whatever the fundamentals of the deal are, there's a point where one party makes an offer. Now, the other party can do a couple of things. They can sit back and do nothing and just go, that's interesting. So that's the deal you'd like to do. Well, if that's all they say, then there's not a contract because there's never been that meeting of the minds that we talked about. Or the party could look at what's been offered and say, don't want to do it. Nope. Sorry, that's not enough money. Or, just this isn't the right time for me to do that deal. So again, suppose that I want to hire you to paint my house and pay you $1,000. And I say, will you paint my house for $1,000? And you look at it and you say, I'm really busy the next couple of weeks. No, I don't think so. I can't do that. That's rejection, okay? I've been rejected many times in my life, and I've made many contract offers that have been rejected. So don't have your feelings too badly hurt by rejection. But that's one way to sort of end the offer that was made. Because I want you to think about an offer. Again, recognize that offers can be oral or they can be in writing and they can be implied. But for a moment, think about the offer conceptually as a piece of paper that's laid on the table. So the one party says, I want you to paint my house for $1,000. And they put that offer on the table. That offer is on the table and available for acceptance until it's rejected, or as this slide shows, or a counteroffer is made, which is a form of rejection that we'll come back to, or a reasonable period of time has passed. Now, as a result, some people get in trouble. They make an offer, they put the offer on the table, and the other party just looks at it and says, that's very interesting. And then they walk away. That's not really rejection. That's just, really interesting. They didn't reject it, they just walked away. Now, as a result, that offer remains on the table. And that party that you've made the offer to could come back in a week, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks and say, I'll do it. Well, what if you've made other arrangements? What if you've spent your money on something else? What if you've hired somebody else? What if? What if? That's the danger that comes from making an offer and letting it sit on the table. So what you need to do if you're making offers is make sure the other party has either accepted it or rejected it, or that a reasonable period of time has expired. Or there's one other thing you could do, and that is you could revoke the offer. And I think that's the option that a lot of people forget. So if I make an offer to you and say, will you paint my house for $1,000? And your response is, that's really interesting. What I need to do, probably to protect myself, is to say, hey, wait a minute, before you leave, I just want you to know I'm revoking that offer. Or, 2 days later, 3 days later, send a note to the person that you've made the offer to and say, by the way, that offer I made, it's being revoked. Because that offer that's out on the table is there and it's existing and eligible to be accepted until it's rejected, by a flat-out rejection, or rejected by a counteroffer, which is just a type of rejection, or a reasonable period of time has passed, or it's been revoked. So the idea that a reasonable period of time has passed, what does that mean? It's variable. It depends. If the offer is to do something that's in a very hot market, where things are changing in value constantly. As an example, suppose the stock market. If I offer to buy your stock in Microsoft this week, and I say I'll give you $300 a share for your Microsoft stock, and then you go and you walk away, and then you come back a year from now when maybe the value has dropped, and you say I'll do it. Well, that's not a reasonable period of time because the price fluctuates quickly and is always in flux. So I think a reasonable period of time there is pretty short. By the same token, if I say, gee, I'd sure like it if you'd, think about this. I'll give you $5,000 for your car. Well, I think it's reasonable to think that that offer remains on the table for a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks even. I don't know. I mean, the value of the car doesn't fluctuate that wildly that fast. Maybe more important would be something like this. Suppose somebody comes and says, gee, I'd really like to, buy what's something that doesn't change. I've got something that doesn't change in value quickly. I think that thing is going to be more likely to have the offer continue to be on the table for a much longer period of time. So again, think about that, and that is the safest thing to do if you're the person making the offer, which in the legal world we call the offeror, and the person who it's made to is the offeree. If you're the offeror, recognize the danger of having an offer that's out there too long, because you can just get yourself in trouble. If the other party hasn't taken it, and you're worried that it might come back and bite you because you might want to sell it to somebody else, for instance, then make sure that they know that you've revoked the offer. Okay? Let's take a look. Let's jump into the peril evidence rule, which is the next slide. The peril evidence rule, what I like about the peril evidence rule is that its name, peril evidence rule, tells you a significant thing about it. It's a rule of evidence. This talks about what the courts will allow in the way of evidence at a trial and what they won't allow in the way of evidence. Some things they'll let in, some things they won't let in. You can't just go to court and shoot your mouth off about whatever you think, despite what you see on TV sometimes. You've got to play by the rules of evidence. The peril evidence rule is an evidence rule. Peril, I knew we'd have a dog bark at some point. So peril is the part of that fools people sometimes. So after you learn peril evidence rule, learn what I've always called it, and that is the four corners rule. And some lawyer, I'm not the only lawyer to call it the four corners rule. And that's why in the little slide I've got, it's got four orange corners. That's because most contracts are written on rectangular paper, heaven forbid. And rectangular paper has four corners, okay? Four corners. What the peril evidence rule says is that unless you fit into one of the exceptions, that if there is a written contract, and again, understand, this is where people get confused. They say, well, peril doesn't have to do with oral and da-da-da-da-da, and I'm thinking of oral contracts. Don't go down that road. Four corners rule. An oral contract never has four corners. A written contract has four corners, okay? So this presumes that there is, in fact, a written contract. There is a written contract that exists, and that written contract, when you get to court, the judge is not going to listen to anybody talk about what the contract means, because the judge is only going to look within the four corners of the contract. It presumes that judges can read. Now, I've been practicing law for almost 50 years now, and most judges can read, and many of them can write as well. So I think it's a reasonable presumption to think that if there's a written contract, the judge can read it. And there's no reason to say, well, Your Honor, let me tell you what the contract what it really means. Or let me tell you what I thought it meant. If the other party is paying any attention, they're going to jump up and say, objection, Your Honor, peril evidence rule. You can't go outside of the four corners to talk about what the contract means. Read it yourself, Your Honor. Okay? That's the peril evidence rule. Four corners rule. Now, there are some exceptions because it's the legal world and we have to have exceptions. So let's go to the next slide. We have the same diagram with the four corners for the peril evidence rule. And what we talk about here are the only two exceptions to the peril evidence rule that I know of. And that is, there is an exception for ambiguity and there is an exception for fraud. Let's talk about ambiguity first. What this means is that the judge will listen to testimony about what the contract means or what the parties thought it meant, or look at documents other than the contract to help understand what the contract means, if on the face of the contract itself it's ambiguous, it's not clear. That doesn't mean that the two parties didn't exactly agree with each other on what they thought one term meant or didn't mean. It means that there is an ambiguity that the judge or some third party can see when they look at it. What would this be? Suppose that I have a contract and the contract says that I will come and wash your windows on December 32nd. Now, you know and I know that there is no December 32nd, but somehow we both signed this contract. We now have a written agreement, and the judge and the dispute that happens at court is about this question of, well, did he perform on time when he, didn't show up on January 1st? Well, when was this contract supposed to be performed? Does December 32nd mean the last day of December? That's a reasonable interpretation. Or does it mean the day after December 31st? That's a reasonable interpretation. I think those are both reasonable interpretations, and on its face, there is no way to know what it means. So at that point, the judge is going to, entertain evidence from both parties, one party or both parties, about what the parties meant. For instance, they may say, gee, Your Honor, they knew I had to have it done by the last day of December because, I needed to have this done so I could have the expense in tax year, 2023, and that's why it had to be done on December 31st, and he knew that. Or the other party says, Your Honor, I know I know that's what he said, but we talked about this, and here's the evidence I have that he said he wanted it done, and he wanted it done at the start of the new year. Well, you can bring in that kind of evidence to help sort out what something like December the 32nd means. So again, it has to be unclear on its face. It's not that, if it's clear on its face, then you're stuck with the four corners. Unless you fit into the other exception, and that is fraud. Now, fraud of the type that we're going to talk about is far less common, but it does happen sometimes. Fraud means that somebody's tried to cheat somebody, and they've tried to cheat somebody in the execution of the contract itself. The example that I've used for years is that if you write a contract in invisible ink, and the first half of the contract says all these wonderful things that you and I are both going to agree to, and then the second part of the contract is in invisible ink that only becomes clear when I put the piece of paper under ultraviolet light, and then voila, we see what it really said, or we pass a flame over and it makes the lime juice or the lemon juice or the milk that the contract was written in, suddenly the letters are visible, and you can actually do that. It's a fun trick. I did it for my granddaughter not long ago. She was very impressed with the magic I performed. This kind of fraud obviously is going to be something that the court will listen to, and even though the other party is going to say, well, there it is, Your Honor, right there between the four corners, you can see that it says, not only will I paint your house for $1,000, but you'll also give me your house. But that second part, and you'll give me the house, was in invisible ink that's only apparent now. The judge is going to say, wait a minute. The other party is telling me that wasn't there, or you hid that, or when you had the contract there to be signed, you had your hand over the one part, the last paragraph. Those are the kinds of things that would be fraud. Pretty unusual, but it is an exception to the parallel evidence rule, and in many respects has to be an exception to the parallel evidence rule, or else it just doesn't really work for us. Okay? So let's do this. We're going to take another short break, and then we're going to tackle the statute of frauds. And the statute of frauds, a lot of people confuse parallel evidence and the statute of frauds because it sounds like, they always get taught sort of at the same time. That's why I'm going to break them into two different video segments so that you don't confuse the two with each other. Totally different thing. Parallel evidence always presumes that there is a written contract so that we can find the four corners, and we're not going to go outside of those four corners to understand what the contract means. We aren't going to look for evidence outside unless you fit into one of the exceptions. All right, take a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the statute of frauds.